As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
Senator Lindsey Graham says there is no limit on Israel killing civilians. So Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina said on Tuesday that there should be no limit on how many civilian casualties Israel incurs in its bombardment of Gaza. So Graham made these comments while appearing on CNN after Israel bombed the Jabalia refugee camp in North Gaza, killing dozens of people. An Israeli military commander was asked after the strike if Israel was aware that the camp was full of innocent civilians and did not deny anything, just said, basically, this is the cost of war. This is the tragedy of war. So Graham was asked about this when he was on CNN, and he was asked if there is a threshold where the U.S. might ask Israel to hold off on causing so many civilian casualties. And Graham invoked World War II and said, quote, "No, if somebody asked us after World War II, is there a limit? What would you do to make sure that Japan and Germany didn't conquer the world? Is there any limit what Israel should do to the people who are trying to slaughter the Jews? The answer is no. There is no limit," end quote. So no limit. Doesn't matter that they're killing all these kids and babies. Just doesn't matter to Graham. Clearly does not matter to the Biden administration as well. And Israeli officials have been pointing to the U.S. and allied bombings of Germany and Japan during World War II, as I've been covering, as an example of, killing of civilians in a war. And, hundreds of thousands, if you combined the estimates of German civilians and Japanese civilians killed by, allied bombing, it gets into the millions. And we don't know the exact numbers. But, this comparison includes dropping the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This is what they're talking about. And Lindsey Graham has previously referenced this as well. When the conflict, the current fighting first started after the Hamas attack, Graham said that if Israel did not do something similar to what the U.S. did in World War II, then it would be making a mistake. He said, quote, "Gaza is going to look like Tokyo and Berlin at the end of World War II when this is over. And if it doesn't look that way, Israel made a mistake," end quote. And again, he mentioned Tokyo. And the firebombing of Tokyo was one of the most brutal things that happened in that war. They estimate 100,000 civilians were killed in a single night. And I know this is kind of a common theme of the stories that I've been covering lately, as the top stories is the fact that there's all these people in the U.S. and Israel basically accepting that there's going to be a lot of civilian casualties. There already clearly are a lot of civilian casualties. And I think it's just the reason why I want to keep focusing on this is because this is a war being funded by the U.S. government. Countries downgrade their ties with Israel over the Gaza bombing. So this is from the Libertarian Institute by Kyle Anzalone. So a trio of South American countries, along with Jordan, have downgraded ties with Israel over the onslaught in Gaza. According to Palestinian sources, the Israeli military operations in Gaza have killed nearly 9,000 people. On Tuesday, Bolivia took the most extreme step and cut all ties with Israel. So that's pretty significant to see Bolivia do that. And they said that the decision that Bolivia, quote, "decided to break diplomatic relations with the Israeli state in repudiation and condemnation of the aggressive and disproportionate Israeli military offensive taking place in the Gaza Strip," end quote. Israel accused them of capitulating to terrorism, of course. Colombia and Chile announced that they would recall their ambassadors from Israel. So not quite severing ties, but withdrawing their ambassadors, which is a significant diplomatic move. And Jordan also joined the South American nations in downgrading ties with Israel. The foreign ministry announced that it was recalling its ambassador. So I think it's significant to see three countries in Latin America, doing this. These aren't Arab countries. These are, countries on the other side of the world that are taking steps to reduce relations with Israel over what they're doing in Gaza. So Ukraine and some European countries are ramping up a lobbying push in the U.S. to get Americans to back more aid to Kiev. Ukrainian officials are seeking new long-range rockets and accelerated training programs. The propaganda push comes after a Time magazine article portrayed Kiev in disarray and as a hotbed for corruption. So according to Politico, quote, "Ukrainian officials and allies in Europe are ramping up their lobbying campaign in the U.S. for new weapons and training," end quote. The authors cite a recent Ukrainian delegation that toured America with a wish list that included they want U.S. Marine Corps training on conducting ship-to-shore operations, new air defenses to take down the Russian glide bombs that are devastating Ukrainian forces, and the long-range single-warhead version of the Army Tactical Missile System, that's the ATACMS, And the Biden administration secretly shipped ATACMS to Ukraine last month, but they gave them the cluster bomb version that has a shorter range than the single warhead, but still it has a pretty decent range, and it gives Ukraine the ability to fire cluster bombs very far, which is just insane. So the representatives of the Ukrainian government are attempting to adapt their message to the current American political landscape. You have a former Ukrainian Marine who is comparing Russians to Hamas. They're trying to tie it all together like Blinken did the other day. We got to keep funding Israel's war. We got to keep funding the war in Ukraine because, they're facing evil like Russia, Hamas, and China's watching. They just want to put all this stuff together.
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
I believe there's never been a better time than now. There are a lot of people who are disgusted with what's going on. And I'm not just saying that, as a thought. It's a fact. When you look at the numbers, polls by Gallup poll, where people look at politicians lower than they do used car salesmen. So there's really been a time. This is the time now to have some dramatic change. And again, it's either occupy peace or die in war, as we say. Judge, you have an article coming out tomorrow, and it relates to what we're talking about in so many different ways, and how we're losing our freedom and peace. And it's about a great man in Moscow. When the Trump administration obtained an indictment of Edward Snowden for violation of the Espionage Act of 1917. Oh, 1917, huh? It was a wonderful time. This is under the Woodrow Wilson administration.
And the most repressive.
Yep.
The most repressive. I mean, Wilson arrested college students for reciting the Declaration of Independence out loud in front of draft offices. And his argument was, well, if people listen to this stuff that Jefferson wrote, they might be deterred from registering for the draft, so we arrested the students. What about the First Amendment, Mr. President? Oh, the First Amendment only prohibits Congress from interfering with freedom of speech. It doesn't prohibit the president. This is the former professor of constitutional law at Princeton University making this argument, which if made on a law exam, you'd get an F.
Yeah, and you graduated Princeton.
Yes.
And this is the same piece of scum crap that gave us World War I.
Right.
The Federal Reserve, federal income tax.
Right. The popular election of senators emasculating the states as states. And he created the administrative state, a government by experts. The government will keep your food safe. The government will keep the booze safe. Trust the government. Remember Ronald Reagan, the 9 most dangerous words in the English language. Hi, I'm from the government. I'm here to help you.
Yeah. Many of us who believe that the Fourth Amendment means what it says, we're deeply critical of the government, and we remain so today. So please explain.
Well, Edward Snowden is the former outside contractor working with the NSA. He's also a former CIA agent who took 2 oaths, one to keep secret whatever his political bosses told him to keep secret, and the other to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. What do you do when the 2 oaths clash? What do you do when he learns that the very government entity that he's working for was engaged in the most massive violation of civil liberties in American history? The Snowden lesson is very instructive to us because it shows what big government will do. All of this is post 9/11. All this is instigated by the worst president in the post-World War II era, George W. Bush. Iran, Iraq, the Department of Homeland Security, the Patriot Act, mass spying on everybody.
Yep.
They have their FISA court. It's just a subterfuge. They go to the FISA court so they can claim they're going to a court to get a warrant. In fact, they're spying on everybody. So in 2006, and I'm sorry this is such a long answer, Gerald.
No, go on.
Bush and the Republican Congress enacted legislation that required every telecom service provider and every internet service provider to allow the federal government to be physically present at their mainframes. And today, the federal government, the NSA, guarded by armed guards carrying AR-15s, is physically present at every mainframe. You get off the elevator at the wrong floor at AT&T's headquarters in San Francisco, you'll be met by people pointing what look like machine guns at you. Welcome to America. Welcome to George W. Bush's America. What are they doing there? They are gathering communications in real time. Every keystroke, you think you deleted something, you haven't. Every keystroke pressed and every syllable articulated in the hands of the federal government, all in violation of the Fourth Amendment. That's what Snowden exposed. When he released this, he did so in Hong Kong to a select group of journalists. And then the government tried to arrest him, and he made his way to Moscow, where the U.S. government couldn't go. As he's landing in Moscow, the State Department switched off his passport, which told the Moscow people not to let him in, whereupon he said, well, I'd rather be stateless than voiceless. Today, he is a dual Russian and American citizen, and the model of personal courage in a free society for exposing what the government did. I once interviewed him with Ron Paul, the three of us. Wow. Ron and I were in Texas. Snowden was on a huge flat screen. We were in front of an audience of a few thousand in Moscow. And I made the argument that what he did is absolutely protected free speech, and that I believed the court would accept that argument and the indictment against him would be thrown out. And he said, Judge, I agree with you, but in order to do that, I have to come back into the United States, and I'm not so sure how I'll be treated by the government. Now, this is the Trump administration which indicted him. And then Trump himself, in an unguided moment, said, oh, that guy Snowden, he should be executed. And then some of us spoke to the president. And then he did a 180. And he said to me, should I pardon him? I said, yes, you absolutely should pardon him. And you should ask your government to instruct the DOJ to dismiss the indictment. Well, it didn't happen. Small world, Trump now stands indicted of the very same charge, the very same statute, the very same section of that statute that his DOJ charged Snowden with.
No wonder the legacy media are terrified. The last thing they need and want are people from across the political spectrum, voices from throughout the culture, recognizing, hey, wait a minute, we all have more in common with one another than we do with this set of interests that are trying to control our free speech and trying to proliferate ideas and even medicines. In a German population study, no healthy children aged 5 to 17 died of COVID. All deaths were in kids with a comorbid condition. Of course, that's very sad, it's awful, it's tragic, it's also important information that in an awakening society we should have access to and should make decisions based upon. US public health officials are not only misinformation spreaders, they're international outliers. The World Health Organization in March came as close as it's ever come to saying healthy children should not get the COVID vaccine, deeming the shot a low priority for healthy young people. I suppose it's hard for the WHO to even be unbiased because look at the way that they are funded. Of course, they receive considerable sums from governments, but also from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, who also invest heavily in vaccine companies. So when it comes to simple declarations or proclamations about what might be good for your children, what might be good for the health of the world, there are competing factors. It's, I suppose, comparable to the discourse around military activity around the world. If apparently neutral voices are biased in favor of a certain type of expenditure and particular types of outcome, how can you trust the discourse? If pundits are not declared as having affiliations with the military-industrial complex or Big Pharma, or funded in some way by Big Pharma or the military-industrial complex, the information you get is biased. That's why it's really dangerous to have people that you might not agree with, like Bill Maher or Candace Owens or Joe Rogan, speaking kind of freely to enormous audiences that are now starting to think, oh yeah, maybe I won't give my children that shot. Fortunately, there are huge numbers of children in America particularly that are obese because of the irresponsible practices of filling them up with corn syrup and crazy glucose and mad sugar and pricing healthy foods out of the reach of many ordinary people. Almost as if there's a convergence of interests that ensure that you're like a little larvae in a blob of glucose waiting for various medications to intervene in your inevitable bad health. In a New England Journal of Medicine analysis, of 136 people hospitalized for vaccine-induced myocarditis, 2 were in a critical condition and one 22-year-old died. The CDC, instead of making public its investigations into children dying immediately after the COVID vaccine, has been busy colluding with big tech to shut down scientific debate and censor true patient stories. That's the kind of sentence that I, after all this time, find difficult to say and difficult to believe. What? They're shutting down debate when children are why is that happening? Because I'll tell you why. Because it's too nefarious to contemplate, really. How does that happen just because of bureaucratic inertia or lack of communication or versions of an accident? It starts to seem evil. Specifically, it's been slapping the misinformation label on medical viewpoints when they differ from its own Ministry of Truth. Indeed, the biggest propagator of misinformation during the pandemic has been the US federal government. I think at this point, trust in the American government, trust in their health organizations and agencies that were supposed to be guiding us through what we were told was a uniquely horrific event where unique measures had to be taken in place, there is no reason for trust because there's been no, I mean, on an interpersonal level, you would expect kind of an acknowledgement and an apology. We're so wrong about all of that. And I can sort of envisage a way out if that's what was happening, but that isn't what's happening. What's continuing to happen is a recommendation of a medicine that now we know a lot more about. And yet the authenticity and honesty is still lagging way behind. And all you can conclude from that is that there's an agenda. This is from the Telegraph in the United Kingdom, talking about many of these issues, including the censorship of discussion around them. People left injured or bereaved from vaccines are being forced to speak in code online about their symptoms for fear of censorship, the COVID inquiry has heard. Baroness Hallett, the inquiry's chair, was also told at a hearing on Wednesday that healthcare workers were afraid to speak out about side effects they'd had from the jab over fears they would be punished by their bosses. It comes as campaign groups representing hundreds of people who suffered illness or lost loved ones after being vaccinated will be allowed to give evidence to the public inquiry. Anne Morris, KC, representing UKCV Family, Vaccine Injured Bereaved UK, and the Scottish Vaccine Injury Group told the inquiry, censorship is a very real issue for the vaccine injured and bereaved. I suppose what we're seeing now is the fruition of matters discussed and considered at the advent of the introduction of the vaccine. Hey, they've been given this indemnity and Pfizer aren't going to reveal these files to 75 years in the future. Well, now the people that have been injured and damaged are beginning to demand some form of compensation for their injuries. Their support groups have been shut down by social media platforms and their experience is censored by the mainstream media. They have to speak in code online for fear of having the only source of support taken away from them. My child died of tomato ketchup. Maybe I gave my child a bit too much tomato ketchup. And the government shouldn't have told us that that tomato ketchup was safe. I mean, when you think about it, they've not even done any trials on that tomato ketchup. And they told us that it stopped transmission when they'd never even tested whether or not it stopped transmission. And do you know that the ketchup that they made in the lab is different from the one that they gave to the people? Wait a minute, these people aren't discussing ketchup, are they? What? Is ketchup bad for you? I eat a lot of that stuff. No, you're fine with ketchup. Phew. We represent one nurse who wishes to remain anonymous. Very wise, Ms. Morris added. She doesn't want her work colleagues to know about her vaccine reaction because she isn't sure of the response she will encounter. 2 years ago, prior to her vaccine, she had a senior position working 12-hour night shifts. She's a single parent and her family relies on her income. 4 days after her second COVID vaccine, the nurse experienced period bleeding for no apparent reason, and 3 days later was diagnosed with bilateral large volume pulmonary embolism, a type of blood clot in the lungs with a right heart strain. Ms. Morris added she's battled for 2 years and now she's managing one 9-hour shift per week in a different role entirely, but that shift is still extremely challenging for her due to ongoing symptoms. Her life has been turned upside down, she's undergone significant trauma, yet cannot speak about the cause for fear of recrimination. Boo! Anti-vaxxer! Shame on you! Anti-vaxxer! Another example was given of a specialist theatre nurse who was diagnosed with vaccine-induced pulmonary fibrosis, a serious and lifelong lung disease which currently has no cure. She was told she would lose her job if she didn't take the vaccine, Ms. Morris said. So despite her misgivings, she went ahead because she's a single mother of 2 children. Now those children are her carers. Hooray! Support key workers, support the NHS, draw a rainbow in your window. Take that vaccine! I think it might make me ill. Your children can look after you. I believe the children are the future. Well, they better be, because the future's here, and the future's appalling.
Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
But interestingly enough, I mean, in the Israeli media, there's much more of a debate on what happened on October 7th than there is in the U.S. And you have, for example, I don't know, I'm sure you know Max Blumenthal, who he is, in The Gray Zone, which I think is a great publication. They came out with, Max came out with a story a couple of days ago, simply following the Israeli press, primarily Haaretz, and a couple of TV stations. But the testimony of those people who were hostages and other information shows that things didn't really happen the way they are being presented. You know, it turns out the Israelis, and this is understandable because governments screw up all the time. They can't do anything right. It turns out that the Israeli army seems like they used tanks and they blew up a lot of these houses in the kibbutzes. That's why so many of the bodies were burned. And so many people were shot. They used Apache helicopters to shoot a lot of people, including a lot of the hostages. So there's always a lot more than meets the eye to these things, and they come out slowly. And, you know, when you start to see the truth, just like in 9/11, you started a few years later thinking, well, hang on, there were so many warnings and nobody listened, nobody paid attention. What's that all about? You know, I think you're starting to hear some of that, but the anger is too raw and too fresh. But the problem is, Tom, now you have, as of the time we're recording this, I think over 8,000 Palestinians killed, including 3,000 children. We're talking on Monday. I was just reading that the Turkish-Palestinian Friendship Hospital has just been hit by Israel, the cancer ward. So you see a lot of this happening. You see a lot of lives being destroyed, but you talk about kill them all. You can't kill them all. It just can't. It can't be done. And so my hope is that if an Israeli who's living there really wants to continue, they would shy away from the extremists and the neocons who say, "Oh yeah, well let's hit Iran. That sounds like a good idea." No way. I mean, if you hate Israel, the number one thing you'd want them to do is to hit Iran or provoke Hezbollah, because it's going to be a lot more Jewish Israelis dead. It's just a bad idea. This is not the Iran of the mid-1980s. Let's just put it that way.
So can you describe the best and worst case scenarios for us as you see them?
Well, we have a Speaker of the House who went on Hannity and urged the Israelis to attack Iran. That's not a good idea. And these guys aren't always the smartest bulbs in the bunch, and I would say definitely he's not. But like you say, the world is different now. And if you have an Israel attacking Iran, the Russians now have an increasingly potent alliance with Iran, let's put it that way. Plus, the Russians feel themselves very vulnerable in Syria. They, in fact, just moved 1,000 more troops into Syria. They have a base there in Tartus and other facilities in Syria. If Israel attacks Iran, there's also going to be an effort to finish the business in Syria. That's what the neocons want more than anything else, is to finish the business in Syria. So if the Israelis listen to the neocons in the U.S., then they're going to find the worst case scenario probably for everyone, which is getting Iran involved, getting Hezbollah involved, getting Hamas even more involved from wherever they are now, and getting the rest of the Arab world. Now, Erdogan, I think, does a lot of talking, and I think he talks out of both sides of his face. He has an enormous Sunni constituency in Turkey. His base are religious Muslims in Turkey, and he gave a fiery speech over the weekend about we need to go into Gaza and take care of these guys and save our people. Now, I think a lot of it was just a lot of hot rhetoric. Nevertheless, it's going to be hard to contain, as you point out, hundreds of millions of people in that vicinity that are going to be inflamed. You can't kill them all, even with their nukes. So the worst scenario would be to listen to the neocons and to escalate. The best scenario, and I think ironically, we're going to start seeing it from the BRICS countries, from what we call the global south, who now are very busy in the General Assembly of the UN for all of its faults, busy in the General Assembly trying to put forth new proposals and I think there was one that just was voted on a couple of days ago. And it turns out the U.S. is in a very small minority. Only 14 other countries voted with the U.S., voted against the proposal by Jordan for a truce. So I think it was France, the UK, and Germany voted against us. So you're finding the U.S. more isolated in the General Assembly, in the UN. So I think you're going to start to see some more momentum among the BRICS nations, among the previously non-aligned countries that are becoming aligned because of U.S. aggressive foreign policy. The best kind of solution would be for it to become obvious, even to Joe Biden or whoever's pulling the strings, even to them, that you are isolated. And probably with the phone call, Biden or whoever does this talking could say, listen, Bibi, we've got to pull the plug on this, because they did it before. Netanyahu pulled out of Gaza before, and this is something I was just re-looking at the other day when he got a call from the U.S. president saying, look, it's about enough right now. If things are getting hot, you need to pull back. And I think that could happen and look for some kind of truce. So that's the best case scenario. The world slowly but surely gets more and more opposed to the U.S. position. And the pressure on Biden, these 11 points that he's just lost in the polls, he starts looking at that and thinking, we got to fix this problem somehow. Give me some sort of a solution.
Well, now let's finish up with this. And then I want to say a little something about the Ron Paul Institute. But obviously, if I turn on a cable news network, I'm going to get the standard line. I know that. I know that if I go to, if Foreign Affairs puts on an event, I'll probably get the standard line. Although occasionally with Foreign Affairs, you might get a few dissident voices here and there. But generally, everybody knows what the standard line is. But I have this sense, though, that even though the political classes are out to lunch on it, and the newspapers and the major networks are out to lunch on it, I have a feeling that there is nevertheless a growing feeling of skepticism, maybe among people who aren't so powerful, who aren't opinion molders, but there are more people who won't necessarily be fooled the next time. Do you think I'm right about that, or is that wishful thinking?
I'd like to think you're right. It's frustrating, and I'm sure Scott Horton feels it. Anyone who's dumb enough to have gone into foreign affairs must feel it, who's on the right side, because, it's the only profession on earth where if you're right, you get kicked in the teeth, and if you're wrong, you get a promotion. You can be Vicky Newland. So it's a thankless task, but I do think that you're seeing a lot more people who are skeptical. As Dr. Paul always says, it's the challenges for us getting our message out and under overwhelming odds. We don't have cable, we don't have anything. We just have a little show, and all of us have our own shows. Getting it out with overwhelming odds against it, and our own inadequacies. I'm speaking for myself only. Inadequacies of delivering the message in an understandable, palatable form. It's not easy to do, especially when people have been so brainwashed for so long. It's a real challenge, but we should be rejoicing in a way, despite all the sadness and bloodshed, because this is our time. This is the time where we can say, look, everything has clearly failed. Non-interventionism is the solution to our problems, and here's why. So it's just a question of how best can we do it?
Senator Graham, I don't know. I wouldn't want to be judgmental, but it looks like he doesn't care. He's mincing no words.
Yeah.
And of course, if you look for all the causes of war and what's going on over there right now, and people that encourage these problems, and of course, I blame our foreign intervention overseas and foreign policy, because and that plus the international organizations like the United Nations and NATO, and then our money, and the money is passed out for political reasons. And even if we wanted to be cautionary with the money and say, you can't do this, this is to help some people here and limit it, it doesn't matter. So that's why the founders were correct. They gave no authority for us to take money from poor people in this country and give it to rich benefactors to fight wars overseas. And then we come in and we chime in and we have, senators that are so well known and say, well, if they get our money and start killing people, and it's, in this case, it's Israel that we're talking about getting the money, but that could be applied to almost any group, and sometimes on both sides, or very often, we send it to both sides and they get together. So the whole principle is wrong. But this caught our attention, and I thought we should express ourselves, exactly how this could be prevented. And I think constitutional government and a non-interventionist foreign policy and a little bit morality, we wouldn't have to worry about this. And probably Senator Graham would have a harder time becoming a senator.
Johnson, the new Speaker of the House, his first action is to start giving money away overseas. But we want to go ahead and recognize one thing that he's done that we agree with. And this is from Jonathan Turley's website. Put the next one up if you can. Republicans joined Democrats in defeating the censure of Representative Tlaib. Now, regardless of what you think about Rashida Tlaib, I think she is Palestinian and she's been very critical of Israel's behavior in Gaza. And so there are some group in the House that wanted to censure her for what she said. And now Jonathan Turley writes, I was impressed by the comments of Speaker Mike Johnson on the measure and the 23 GOP members who took the unpopular step of voting against the measure, even though they disagreed with her viewpoints. And go to the next one. Here's where Johnson explained himself. In an appearance with Fox host Sean Hannity last night with other GOP members, Johnson explained that he opposed such measures in the interest of free speech. He noted that members say controversial things all the time, and that it is a slippery slope to use such disciplinary measures in a tit-for-tat pattern. So good for him.
When people reach this point, you really have to say, great, great, great.
Yeah.
But we keep wondering, but we encourage people, put this whole thing together and apply those same principles to some other issues too.
Yeah.
But, who knows where. He was probably pretty good on, the freedom of speech during the COVID epidemic, my guess would be. But it's like some people would pick one but not the other one and say, well, public health is a different story and we have to stop this and we should close it down. Or they might want to regulate the internet for a different reason instead of just saying what he has said about this. So, yes, I think he deserves a compliment. We ought to give him a star for today.
Star for the day, that's right.
And just look at the attitude about how many children have been killed over in the Middle East. And it seems to be a lot of people aren't too worried about the kids either who are getting killed. Maybe Senator Graham could talk about that.
Yeah, no, he likes that. Well, I just out of curiosity, I looked it up. So the first thing Mike Johnson wanted to do was send $106 billion overseas, divided between Ukraine and Israel, not equally, but divided between the two. $106 billion overseas on these useless wars. Well, I looked up the cost of SNAP, which is the welfare program. Put that next one up. In fiscal year 2021, the government spent about $111 billion on SNAP. So they're virtually identical costs. One, however, is welfare for the poor, which is SNAP. But the other is welfare for the rich, which is U.S. sending money overseas, which actually just goes to our military-industrial complex. Both of them are welfare. One's for the poor and one's for the rich.
So you're picking on the rich welfare recipients. Well, that's why the principle of transfer of wealth, taking money out of people's wallets, stealing it through inflation, and assuming that the government owns everything you earn, and they let you spend your first penny by permission.
Yeah.
They have control of your income.
Absolutely. Well, let's move on to the next one, and this is a short one, but it needs to be said because they voted on HRES 559, I think it was yesterday, and it was declaring that it's the policy of the U.S. that a nuclear Islamic Republic of Iran is not acceptable. Now, you remember these kinds of resolutions in the run-up to the Iraq War. Literally about every other week, there'd be another one. And it would be, this is just a sense of Congress, just a sense of Congress. Well, Thomas Massie was the only Republican no vote on this, and this is the second time in a week that he's taken a tough vote, and he's going to get hammered. They're going to put someone up against him, and he's going to get hammered. But he explained himself why he voted that way, if you put the next one on. Because of the language, he read the bill, and this is down in the resolved clauses. It says that the United States will use all means necessary to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. Now, he circled that and said, I do not want Iran to get a nuclear weapon, but I will not vote to give Joe Biden this power. All means necessary. And they snuck that in. Go to the next clip, because this is the bill here, not surprisingly entered in by Mr. McCall, the biggest warmonger, one of the biggest, H-Res 559. And then go to the next one. Here are some of the resolve clauses. Now, this is where the enacting clauses of a resolution is. This is the meat of it. The other stuff is just sort of the coding, right? But it's this policy of the U.S. that we will use all means necessary to prevent Iran from obtaining a weapon. I almost read that, Dr. Paul, as an authorization for force.
Yeah, right. You know, one thing they do when they're debating what a country can do or prevent it from doing is Israel has the right of self-defense, as if that's the final thing. But I'm for the right of self-defense. Matter of fact, I had at times have voted for the right of Israel for self-defense when there weren't very many other, like no other Republican did it, because I did believe that they have a right of self-defense. But that doesn't mean that it means that it's limited to it. Why is it that all countries should have the right of self-defense? But that isn't what they're saying. I mean, it's meant to be targeted. It reminds me of the attitude of all Black Lives Matter.
Yeah. Of
course they do. But can you imagine getting into trouble because you've accepted, well, morally, all lives matter.
Yeah.
And I sort of come from that position, and sometimes very small human life. I think that all lives do matter, and if it's totally ignored, I think society deteriorates, and there's a little bit of deterioration going on in this country.
Yeah.